The morning was ordinary. Harold Thomas, a man of 72, sat in his small kitchen in a quiet suburb of Milwaukee, stirring sugar into his coffee like he had every day for years. The faded curtains swayed in the breeze, and the hum of a distant lawnmower buzzed outside. He wore the same cardigan he always did, and the little black and white TV on the counter droned with the morning news. It was routine, predictable, safe. For as long as Harold could remember, which wasn't all that long, this had been his life. He didn't recall much from before 2015, just scattered fragments the doctors had called traumatic memory loss, the result of a head injury from a car crash. Or at least, that's what the record said. He had no family, no past he could name, just a name on his ID and a job at a small hardware store run by a kind man named Rick, who had given him work and a couch when he first arrived at the hospital with no one to claim him. Harold had accepted the blank slate without question. It was easier not to wonder. But that morning, everything changed. He had dropped his wallet, an old, creased leather one he never remembered buying, and when he picked it up, a photo slipped out from a hidden slot he'd never opened. It was small, aged, and in black and white. In it stood a young man in military uniform, arms slung around another soldier, both smiling with wide, carefree expressions. Behind them a tank, and in the corner, barely legible, the date, 1970. Harold stared at the photo, something in his chest tightening. The young man on the left looked familiar. Too familiar. He flipped it over. On the back, written in faint pencil, were the words, Tommy and Ray, Cambodia. He felt dizzy. Cambodia? Military? Tommy? His fingers trembled. He stood and moved to the mirror above the sink, holding the photo beside his face. The nose, the eyes, older now, weathered, but the resemblance was undeniable. That's me, he whispered. He didn't know how he knew. He just did. That night, sleep refused to come. Harold sat at his small table, the photo before him like a puzzle piece that didn't fit in the picture he'd lived with for nearly a decade. Had he been a soldier? Was his name even Harold? He ransacked the apartment for other clues, documents, keepsakes, anything, but found nothing. His belongings were sparse. A few clothes, a toothbrush, a book on gardening he didn't recall buying. And now, this photo. He went to Rick the next morning. Did I ever mention serving in the military? Rick looked up from the counter, surprised. Number, you told me you had a head injury, and the hospital didn't say much more. Why? Harold handed him the photo. Rick studied it. This looks like Vietnam era. Are you saying this is you? I think so, Harold said. I found it in my wallet. I don't know who Ray is or why I never saw this before. Rick nodded slowly. Maybe it's time to find out. That afternoon, Harold took the first step. He walked into the local VA office. The receptionist was polite but skeptical. Do you have a military ID number? Service records? No, Harold said, just this. He showed her the photo. She studied it, then picked up the phone. Within an hour, a man named Officer Layton, mid-50s and formal in tone, came in and asked Harold to follow him. They sat in a private room. So, Layton said, you think this is you in the photo? Yes, Harold said, but I don't know for sure. I lost my memory in 2015. Car accident. I woke up in a hospital. No next of kin, no records, nothing. Layton nodded. May I scan the photo? Harold agreed, and the man carefully scanned both sides. I'll run this through our archives. If you served, there'll be a file. Might take a day or two. Harold thanked him and left, heart pounding. He didn't know what he expected. Confirmation? Closure? Maybe even more questions. That night, he sat with the photo and stared at the face of the man beside him. Ray. Who was he? A friend? A brother? Why couldn't he remember? He whispered the name aloud, testing it. Ray. The sound stirred something deep inside. An image, a flash, a jungle, a helicopter overhead, heat, shouting, the smell of smoke. Then, gone. The next day, Officer Layton called. I need you to come in. We found something. At the office, he slid a folder across the desk. You were born Thomas Harold Reagan. You served in the U.S. Army, deployed to Vietnam from 1969 to 1971. You were listed as MIA in 1971 during an ambush, presumed dead. Your family held a memorial. But in 2015, a man with no ID was admitted to a Milwaukee hospital. It was you. Harold, or Thomas, stared at the file. Inside was his enlistment photo. It matched. Raymond Castillo, Leighton continued, was your best friend in the unit. He wrote several letters to your family after. You disappeared. Is he alive? Thomas asked. Leighton sighed. He passed away in 2008, cancer. But he left behind a daughter. Name's Maria. She lives in San Antonio. Thomas felt a strange mix of grief and hope. Ray was gone, but maybe Maria could tell him more. Who he was, what kind of man he'd been, why he had vanished. Leighton handed him Maria's contact. You should reach out, he said. That night, Thomas sat with the photo again, no longer a stranger to his own face. For the first time, he had a name, a history. Thomas Reagan sat quietly on the bus bound for San Antonio. The hum of the engine a low lull beneath the thoughts racing in his head. The old photograph safe in his coat pocket like a compass, pointing toward the life he never knew he had. He had made the call the night before, dialing the number Officer Leighton had given him with trembling fingers and a stomach twisted in knots. The voice on the other end was cautious but kind. Maria Castillo, daughter of Raymond Castillo, his best friend, she had paused when he introduced himself as Thomas Reagan, and when he told her about the photo, the silence on the line had been long and emotional. She finally said, My father talked about you until the day he died. And that was all it took. She invited him to visit. No questions asked, no hesitation. And now he was on his way to meet the only link left to a past, wiped from his memory like dust blown off an old shelf. The bus rolled through long stretches of road, past fields and small towns that felt vaguely familiar. Though he couldn't name any, his reflection in the window looked foreign and familiar all at once. And the more he stared at his face, the more he felt both closer to and farther from the man in the photo. When the bus pulled into the San Antonio terminal, the sun was high and hot, and Thomas stepped off with a single bag slung over his shoulder. Maria had said she'd be waiting near the taxi stand, and when he saw her, he knew it was her before she waved. Mid-40s, strong features, her father's eyes. They shook hands, and she smiled, but it was tinged with sadness, as if seeing him brought back pieces of her father, too. They drove in silence at first, her car old but clean, and finally she said, You look like the man in the photo, older of course, but he's there. Thomas didn't know what to say, so he simply nodded and looked out the window. Her home was modest, nestled in a quiet neighborhood, filled with large oak trees and wind chimes. Inside were photos of her father, medals on the wall, and a framed picture of two young soldiers, him and Ray, the same one from his wallet, but cleaner, brighter. She handed it to him gently, and he studied it with a quiet reverence. He never believed you died, she said, sitting across from him. Everyone else accepted it. But he said you wouldn't go like that. He said you'd come back, and every year he wrote you a letter, even without an address. Thomas's throat tightened. He wanted to remember Ray's voice, his laugh, anything. But all he had were fragments. Heat, the sound of helicopters, a burst of light, then blackness. Maria brought out a box from the closet, worn but carefully kept, and inside were Ray's letters, photos, and a journal. He wrote about you, she said. Maybe it'll help. Thomas spent hours flipping through the pages, reading the words of a man who had once been closer than a brother. The entries were filled with shared stories, pranks, firefights, dreams of returning home. One entry read, Tommy saved my life today, again. He never talks about fear, but I know he feels it. We all do. But he hides it better than anyone. Another said, Tommy says when the war ends, he's going to open a garage, fix cars, live somewhere quiet. I'll probably follow him. Maybe we'll both find peace somewhere, Thomas read, until his eyes burned and his heart ached with a grief he couldn't fully place. Grief for a life lost and a friendship interrupted by time and trauma. That night he couldn't sleep, the ceiling fan spinning above him. As the journal rested on the nightstand beside the photo, he closed his eyes and tried to remember Cambodia, the ambush, the moments before everything vanished. He saw flashes, shouting, gunfire, smoke, Ray pulling him behind a tree, the sound of something exploding too close. Then silence. In the morning, Maria made coffee and they sat together on the porch. He asked about Ray's last years, and she told him stories of a man who never stopped hoping, who helped other veterans, who kept a folded American flag on his nightstand and a photo of Tommy Reagan in his wallet. He never let go, she said, even when everyone told him to. They visited the cemetery that afternoon, and when Thomas stood before Ray's grave, the weight of it all collapsed in his chest. He knelt and placed the photo at the base of the stone, whispering, "I'm sorry," though he didn't fully understand what for. Sorry for not remembering, for not coming back sooner, for letting the silence last so long. They stood in silence until the wind picked up, rustling the leaves like distant whispers from a war that had never fully ended. Back at the house, Maria handed him one last envelope, sealed and yellowed. "He left this, just in case," she said. Thomas opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting shaky but clear. "Tommy, if you ever read this, it means you made it back. You always said memory was a tricky thing, but friendship isn't. You were my brother in that jungle, and if you don't remember me, that's okay. I remember you, and I always will. Welcome home. Ray." Thomas sat in stunned silence, reading it again and again, the tears quiet but unstoppable. That night he lay awake not with confusion but with a strange sense of peace. He didn't remember everything, not yet, but the picture had started a chain reaction, and now Ray's voice echoed in his mind like a distant song returning on the wind. He had a name, a history, and now, thanks to a photo in a wallet, a reason to keep searching for who he was. The morning after reading Ray's letter, Thomas stood in front of the mirror in Maria's hallway, studying the face that was finally beginning to feel like his own, not just a stranger in a reflection, but someone with a name, a past, a purpose. There were still empty spaces in his memory, entire years swallowed by the fog of trauma, but the photo had sparked something deeper than memory. It had sparked identity. Maria had offered him the spare room for as long as he needed, and he had gratefully accepted, unsure of where else to go. For the first time in years, he felt he was exactly where he was meant to be. Over the next few weeks, Thomas dove into Ray's journal, rereading each entry until he could almost hear Ray's voice in the words. Each line gave him more than history. It gave him emotion, friendship, a connection that had somehow survived the silence of time and loss. With Maria's help, Thomas visited local veterans centers and libraries, searching for anything else that might fill in the blanks. In a dusty archive downtown, he found a newspaper clipping from 1971 with his name listed among the missing, his photo beneath it, younger, eyes sharp with determination under the headline, "5 Soldiers Missing After Ambush in Cambodia." Beside it, a letter to the editor from Ray, pleading for continued search efforts, saying, "My friend is still out there. I know it." Thomas stared at the article, a strange pride rising in his chest. Ray had fought for him long after the fighting had stopped. Back at Maria's house, they sorted through old boxes, one filled with cassette tapes. "Dad used to record messages," she said, handing him a Walkman. Thomas hesitated, then pressed play. Static filled the silence. Then Ray's voice, older and slower than the one in the journal. "Tommy, if you're hearing this, then somehow the world brought you back. And I just want you to know, I never stopped waiting." The voice cracked with emotion. "Emotion. You weren't just a friend. You were my brother. We were boys when we went in, but we became men together. And not a day went by that I didn't wish we'd both made it out." Thomas listened to the tapes for hours, the words helping him patch together the person he'd once been. There were moments when a phrase or a story would trigger a brief image in his mind. Ray laughing, the buzz of insects in the jungle, the cold metal of a rifle, pieces of a puzzle slowly coming together. One day, Maria came home with an envelope. "I pulled some strings," she said. "This is your VA file. It's been updated." Thomas opened it slowly, Inside were pages confirming his reentry into the system, his benefits, his official reinstatement as a veteran, a recognition that he was no longer just a shadow, but someone seen again, known again. That weekend, they visited a local veterans memorial, where Ray's name had once been etched in stone as a fallen soldier's friend. Thomas stood there, hand gently resting on the cool granite, and beside Ray's name was now an added line: in memory of Thomas H. Reagan, found, not forgotten. He felt something settle inside him, a sense of peace he hadn't known he was missing. He whispered, "Thank you, Ray," and closed his eyes. Months passed, and Thomas began to speak at local veteran events, telling his story not as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to the bonds that war forged, bonds that neither time nor silence could erase. He became a mentor to younger veterans, guiding those lost in their own fogs of memory and pain, reminding them that identity isn't just memory, it's love, connection, legacy. Maria eventually printed Ray's journal and donated copies to local libraries, titling it Letters to Tommy, a Brother at War. Thomas wrote the foreword himself, each word a tribute to the man who had waited for him. Even when the world gave up one autumn morning, he returned to the cemetery, standing once more before Ray's grave, the photo they'd shared now laminated and placed beside the stone. "I found myself again," he said quietly, "because you never stopped looking." And with that, he placed a fresh flower, turned, and walked back into the sunlight. Not as a lost man, but as Thomas H. Reagan, a soldier, a friend, a man whose story had been paused, but never erased.